Okay, so welcome to the video. We're talking about notes for an FBI meeting that I had. I went to the Tbilisi embassy, the U.S. embassy in Tbilisi today, to speak with the legate of the FBI at the embassy. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about the meeting at the beginning of this video, a little bit at the end, and disperse throughout. So in the middle, we're going to be going over these notes that I made for the meeting. They actually didn't allow me to take my phone in despite my request. They said the agent could decide, and the agent asked me to begin a 45-minute meeting without my notes and see how it went before requesting the notes again. So I just went for it without them. But this is the presentation I want to make. I think only about 60% of what I wanted to communicate got communicated. So when I got there, there was like this kind of, what you call it, like security thing outside of the building, and then there was another one inside of the building. They told me it was pretty standard. I didn't have any objections to that. That's standard as long as it was the same treatment everyone got. So that wasn't a big deal. The FBI agent was friendly in a spy-ish sort of way. He was a very he was maybe he gave me a social hearing rather than a serious hearing. He came in pre-decided, and the guy who I talked to in the phone did he did get my passport and my name on my passport, so I feel like they did some sort of check beforehand. So I'm going over these notes, and I am going to be sending a copy of this video to the legate or to the agency in general. So my purpose was four things. So there's four things I wanted to accomplish when I went to the meeting. I wanted them to understand the totality of the circumstances, right? So when I was presenting the totality of the circumstances, and this is kind of how I'm doing it in my legal case, my civil case also, is that I wanted them to understand the nature of order that I was subjected to, right? This is the easiest way for me to talk about it because I am slightly autistic and have like Asperger's or something, and it's my mind is more theoretical, and so I'm always inducing. And so the induced theory is easier for me to talk about rather than, the particulars of the situation. Like when I try to talk about the story or the narrative in a linear fashion, it becomes hard to share all the relevant details. But if you ask me to talk about the abstract wholeness of the situation, it's easier. So these are some names that I have for the nature of cults or psychopathic order. That an aggregate of psychopaths, inevitably forms. An aggregate of psychopaths inevitably forms this sort of order. So the first name is conscienceless, unconscionable, psychotic order, right? Conscienceless meaning there's no concern of ethics, there's no coherence whatsoever. There's no rule of law. Whatever law is referred to is used for the interests of the powerful, but it's never used in favor of the weak, right? So conscienceless, unconscionable, meaning it cannot be tolerated within an equitable society, especially one whose constitution acknowledges equity as part of the law, like English equity as part of the law. So it's conscienceless and it's unconscionable, meaning it cannot be tolerated by a constitutional society or a republic subject to the U.S. Constitution. A psychotic, I mean clinically diagnosable psychotic, right? The Johnny Depp trial is going on currently, and the special psychologist named Amber Heard to be borderline, and I feel like maybe they're borderline, but I'm pretty sure they're psychotic, right? So basically, what I'm saying is in pre-modern, central India, they still have like tribalistic society, and so that tribalistic society that's pre-modern has basically everyone, the strong or psychopathic, sociopathic, malignantly narcissistic, sadistically domineering, and the weak people are they have to be like bipolar, borderline, codependent, fundamentally, and also what's the word, histrionic, I can't say that, but that diagnosis, everyone has some version of that, and through the collusion of such personality types, you have kind of a corporate order where everyone is dehumanized and disassociated, and they are therefore able to act in a corporate form. They're like a corporate body. They act like a beehive rather than as individuals in a republic. They act as dehumanized clogs in a corporate machine, right? They're a corporate body. They act as a conglomerate, and this isn't well understood in the West. And this is something where, when I tried to explain this to the agent, he was not wanting to understand this. And this is where I feel that, he referred to, he'd been in the agency for like 20 years, and he kept referring to like in his experience. And the whole idea is that, immigrants and the children of immigrants are vulnerable to specific forms of abuse that will not be typical. And because they're not typical, there needs to be novel application of the law, like substantial criminality, substantial injustice, substantial subversion of ordered liberty is what should be attended to, and they should pay attention to as federal police officers who have like duty to the people. That's what they should be paying attention to. They should not be paying attention to like the way something has been prosecuted in the past. So obviously, when you have this sort of corporate order, right, where you have dehumanized, disassociated people acting as a corporate body, like a corporate conglomerate, that is clearly a conspiracy to deprive rights. So anyone who doesn't conform, who won't be dehumanized, who won't disassociate, will be punished for their nonconformity within that crypto-fascist sort of order. So that is something I felt like the FBI agent didn't really pay attention to, really wasn't willing to understand, that pre-modern society is fundamentally and substantially different. And this is especially hypocritical or heinous for them not to try to understand this, as the US did invade, Afghanistan and Iraq. And one of the reasons for failure in those missions was failure to understand the fundamental difference of psychology between a pre-modern and a modern society. It's not a philosophical difference, right? Even someone who comes from a pre-modern society, who claims to be have modern values, is still psychologically pre-modern. And that's what happens with a lot of immigrants who consciously may value modern values and therefore emigrate from their countries and immigrate into the United States of America. But they're psychologically pre-modern, and so their aggregate behavior and the patterns of aggregate behavior over time recreate the norms of pre-modern society. And that is something that needs to be understood both by the FBI, the US government, all that sort of stuff. Okay. So the next name I have for this type of order is unjust, willfully tyrannical order. Unjust, willfully tyrannical order. And this is where I try to emphasize the Declaration of Independence. And I told the FBI agent that it's basically the order that I'm referring to is precisely substantially the same. It is exactly substantially identical to the order of 1776 England at the time of the separation, right? So the reason America declared its independence from England was because this type of order existed throughout England, right? This is exactly the type of order that existed throughout England, and that's why the colonists separated from England, right? Because they did not want to be subject to willful tyranny. It was willful tyranny, it was arbitrary, there was no point, it was destructive to everyone. There was no reasonability, there was no rationality to why the king was behaving the way he was behaving. Right? He was totally incoherent. He was despotic. He just wanted to have a power trip, and he wanted people to remain subject to the power trip and suffer the power trip, and just because he's the king, right? So you can't have something like that. You cannot have a psychopath with power insisting on inflicting arbitrary harm, arbitrary inefficiencies on society, just to gratify his own sadistic ego, right? You can't have that. So unjust, willfully tyrannical order, or another way to put this is unjust, arbitrary order. Now, of course, that was all of England. This is miniature, it's subversive, it's occurring within the broader ordered liberty, but it's still the same type of order. And I even told him that, I grew up in Louisiana, but de facto I grew up in Pakistan, right? Like it was a Pakistani order, like extended and projected into the United States of America, right? So, anyways, let's move on to the next one. So inequitable oppressive order. Inequitable is a throwback to equity, equity law or equity jurisprudence, right? So it's inequitable, so it's fundamentally contradictory to equitable notions of how order should be within a republic or within a common law nation. And it's also fundamentally contradicting equality. So what happens in this sort of order, there's a psychopathic dominance hierarchy, right? So it's not just that the king is sadistic, it's that everyone is sadomasochistic, right? Everyone is masochistic in relationship to the person who is in a higher status. So everyone is masochistic in relationship to the king, but then everyone is sadistic to people beneath them. So there's no respect for someone who is quote unquote beneath you in a hierarchy. There's actually proactive bullying of that person. So there's a hierarchy of bullies where the king gets to bully everyone, the second in command gets to bully everyone except the king, and the king bullies the second in command. There's this kind of hierarchy, like prima nocta, if you're familiar with that, like the lord of the manor, deflowering the virgin on her wedding night instead of her husband, right? This sort of sadistic behavior, that's degradatory to the person beneath you, is the very nature of pre-modern ultra regressive conservative society that hasn't gone through the enlightenment, right? This is the very nature of crypto feudal hierarchy or crypto feudal order. Feudal order cannot exist without the sadomasochistic hierarchy. They're one and the same, right? Like feudal order and feudal order cannot exist without this form of sadomasochistic bullying occurring on every level within every relationship that exists, right? It cannot exist. That's the very nature of it. That is the micro phenomena that establishes feudal order, pre-modern feudal order, right? So I kind of covered these together: inequitable oppressive order, pre-modern crypto feudal order. Let's get to E right here. It says anti-republican crypto fascist order. So the United States of America was founded as a republic, right? Which means it's not a democracy, it's a republic, which means individual rights. It's a natural rights republic, so our rights come from God. God gave us our rights. And the republic exists, government exists to secure these rights, right? Life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. To a certain point, like, I kept trying to tell him, I've been deprived of my rights. And then finally, it's like, what rights have you been deprived of? And I just, like, kind of snidely, but seriously, I'm like, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, And so that's this sort of order, because it's not even about their own interests. It is to some degree. It's more about hurting the other person, right? Because you don't want the other person to who was previously below you or beneath you in an order, right? You don't want that person rising higher than you. You don't want the person beneath you rising higher than you, And so you're always trying to subvert the person who's lower than you, even if it's like your son, right? Like, even if it's your son or your younger brother or whoever it is, you're always trying to keep them in their place beneath you. You're always trying to keep them in their place beneath you. And if they won't stay beneath you, what you try to do is you try to get them to be beneath those people who they would be above. So the ultimate humiliation that you can deliver to someone in crypto feudal society, in which the person who is previously lower than you is being uppity and won't stay lower than you because they have some sort of merit that can give them rise. If that happens, the only thing the ultimate humiliation of that uppity person is to ensure, by subverting their success, that they end up lower than other people who they would naturally, or within that order naturally, be above. So like your younger siblings or your younger cousins, right? That sort of thing. So you're constantly subverting them. You know what I'm saying? So that's what I mean. This type of order frustrates innovation. This is why the Middle East and Pakistan are such miserable places to live, is because there's no meritocracy. So it's when I say anti-republic, I also mean anti-meritocracy. And when I say crypto-fascist order, it's basically why I said crypto-fascist is because it is a fascist order, but obviously within the American Republic, within the borders of the United States, uh, these people can show their true character. They can't show who they really are, so they wear a mask of modernity. So they do have a veneer or a mask or a face of modernity, but they are not modern in their psychology. They're only modern on the face of things. And in their true character, their true relationship to power, their true pattern of behavior over time, they're pre modern. And what fascism is, it's basically feudalism. Fascism is feudalism, but because it's happening in an era where modernity or the Enlightenment has already occurred in Europe, and like modernity and the tools of modernity and the fruits of modernity are available, fascism is feudalism, but it just looks a little different, right? It just looks a little different. So crypto feudalism and crypto fascism are kind of synonyms, but in some regards, crypto feudalism is more appropriate, and in some regards, crypto fascism is more appropriate. Another way to say this name is a crypto fascist chain of command. A crypto fascist chain of command. Okay, the last name I have for this order is foreign invasive order. So foreign invasive order, right? So the order it's foreign to the United States of America, right? It's a bunch of immigrants coming in individually, and on this side of the citizen's test, on the naturalization oath, on this side of the oath, on this side of the citizen test, they're recommuning, regathering, and regrouping, and the same norms that exist back in Pakistan or India are re-emerging in the aggregate of the immigrants, right? They're re-emerging amongst the aggregate of the immigrants, and they're behaving as a collective, right? They cannot help this, it's inevitable. When they come here and they don't integrate, they re-commune with one another, the communal patterns of behavior are going to be the same that they were back home. It's inevitable. You understand that? Like when you have a bunch of people coming from the same kind of culture or order, and they come into the United States and they recommune on this side of this, instead of integrating, they just regather into a quote unquote community, but a subversive order de facto. What happens is that it's basically importing a miniature of that order. So that order that exists, quote unquote, back home is projected and extended into the United States of America, even though it's incoherent and inconsistent with the American way of life, right? So it's completely, it's contradictory of the republic. It's against a republican form of government, and it's subversive to the order that should be rendered by the laws of the republic, but it just forms because America is an immigrant nation, right? So this happens. Okay, so this, like I said at the beginning, the purpose of this meeting was four things. I didn't get to go over it systematically like I would have liked. But now we're starting the second part. So the second thing I wanted was for them to report particular crimes that happened to me and my mom in regard to the totality of the circumstances, right? So you have this big totality of circumstances that we've been over, and there's particular crimes, right? So that's the wholeness, and these are particulars within the wholeness. So the main thing I learned, the main thing was human rights treaties. So there's 10 human rights treaties that have been ratified by the U.S. Congress, right? They've been ratified by the U.S. Congress, but I found out today that there is no agency that enforces them as a criminal matter. So even though these human rights have been ratified, some of these treaties are self-executing. They are basically only civil law. They're not criminal law, which makes no sense to me. The whole point of human rights law is to criminalize certain violations of basic human rights, right? But I found out today the United States has no policing agency whatsoever. The FBI only does certain particular small things regarding to human trafficking, right? But the human rights treaties are not criminal law. They're basically only civil law. You can incorporate them into a court of record in civil proceedings, but you cannot use them as a basis of a criminal complaint. That's just kind of what I found out today. And maybe the officer was wrong, but that was really surprising to hear, and I really did clarify a bunch of times, and he just like, you got to look it up online, but I don't know what agency would prosecute these treaties. That's just ridiculous. I don't understand that. So if any of you have information on that, please do follow up. The second one was RICO. If you know about RICO, which is basically the racketeering, criminal organizations law, all that sort of stuff, I do think my situation or the totality of the circumstances, like this tort order, RICO would apply in substance, and there could be an equitable praetor-like extension of RICO law to apply to this situation. Maybe even if RICO doesn't apply directly, Title 18 is FBI jurisdiction, and this is also something that I was really surprised about. 241 and 242 here, right? Title 18, 241 and 242. Both of these is a deprivation of rights and a conspiracy to deprive rights, right? This is FBI jurisdiction, but they refused. They said that it didn't apply, which makes no sense. Based upon the discussion that we just had here, it makes no sense to me. I feel like Title 18, 241, and 242 perfectly describes this situation. Like, perfectly. You understand what I'm saying? This situation is perfectly described by Title 18, 241, and 242. And I just this law here, Title 18, 241, and 242, perfectly describes the totality of the circumstances that are being talked about here. And then when you come to human rights violations, so does RICO a little bit, but definitely Title 18, I feel like it's undebatable, right? And then when you come to human rights violations, the human rights violations talk about the particular violations that were committed by the particular violations that were committed by said order over here. So this is like the particulars, and Title 18 is talking about the totality of the circumstances. I feel like that's perfectly clear, and that should be basis of a filing of a case to prosecute. I just don't understand why that didn't happen. Also, one of the problems was we only got to the religious nonconformity and religious liberty thing at the end of the conversation, and I think I should have led with that, because that really is it. Being punished for exercising religious liberty. Being punished for nonconformity and exercising religious liberty is basically the essence, and that's where human rights law perfectly applies. To describe the organization, Title 18 applies, but human rights treaties apply to describe severe sadistic torture and punishment for failure to comply with this order and exercising religious liberty in the face of that order. He acknowledged, just based upon his questioning, I was led to a certain framing, and the whole situation is over 40 years, and so there's a lot of sub totalities to the totality, and so one of the subtotalities is well described by restraint on commerce. There were like commercial aspects to this, right? And it just because it's the nature of talking to a secular person in their capacity as an agent of the government, and then me trying to be reasonable, it just the nature of the conversation that emerges, that there's a focus on commercial and relatable economic matters, and there's less of a focus on like more substantial matters. And so what was described, he himself admitted that there was it seems like his words were business dealings that didn't work out. And I feel like that aspect of the situation is well described by restraint on commerce. And if you understand, that's a huge deal, right? Restraint on commerce is a huge deal. Also, fraud. I just looked this up on their website, and fraud is definitely part of their jurisdiction, and there's systematic promissory fraud, fiduciary fraud over a long period of time. Is existential fraud is basically a way to describe the totality of the circumstances. Also, is where you're using ecclesiastical law like Islamic law or Catholic law or whatever. You're using ecclesiastical law to control people. You're also using ideas of American republicanism or principles of American republicanism and contract, right? Constitutional contract to control people. But you yourself are not being controlled by ecclesiastical law or American republicanism, but de facto you are controlled by conscienceless, unconscionable, psychopathic order. You're controlled by the laws or the norms of these types of order, and you're enforcing those type of order, and you're gaining the power to enforce those type of order by undue influence, leverage, fraud, deception, authoritative influence, religious authority. You're gaining the ability to do this, commit fraud or commit fraud. You're gaining the power to do that by these systematic factors. Okay, and that is within their purview. I don't know why that was so difficult to understand. Fiduciary negligence, I don't know if that comes, but it's basically from a formative age, from a very young age, you're inducing deep reliance, right? You're inducing extreme reliance, perfect reliance, and then you're using that to control the person. But then after inducing reliance and taking responsibility, at least prima facie, you're neglecting duty that's causing damage. So you're disempowering the person. You're training them to be helpless, right? But after you train them to be helpless, you're not fulfilling the duty that you committed to fulfill, right? So this fiduciary negligence to an extreme level. And it's proactively maintaining reliance, right? You're doing things to manage expectations authoritatively, where you're maintaining the reliance, you're enforcing the reliance, you're coercing, even, you're coercing reliance against the intelligence of the person, right? So that's very important, right? Like Stockholm syndrome, the person is an intelligent person. Anyone who suffers Stockholm syndrome is an intelligent person, but they're being forced, right? They're being forced to against their own intelligence to rely on the person, right? That can happen. That's a psychological phenomena that's well understood. And so you're forcing the person to rely on you. You're coercing them to rely on you despite their rationality, despite their intelligence, despite your previous patterns of behavior, because you have systematic leverage over them. You have to understand that person has systematic leverage. Okay, going next, money laundering. So actually, one of my father's associates was caught money laundering. So one of the things that immigrant communities do is that, like, for example, especially in the Pakistani community, but I'm sure in the Middle Eastern community also, but definitely all sorts of immigrant communities, one of the things they do is, like, for example, I'll give you $100,000 in America. Like, if I have cash that I'm not trying to I don't want I want to launder it or whatever, I'll give it to you in America, and you'll give me like 100,000 minus some fee or whatever back home in Pakistan. And that empowers me to conduct a deal there, and this empowers you to conduct a deal here, right? So there's a lot of that going on in immigrant communities. I actually know a couple people who are facilitators of this. I won't say their names here, but who are facilitators of this, and one guy actually got caught. The FBI itself investigated a person in our community and caught the person doing this, right? So money laundering is a big deal, and this is the way they do it. And that's been going on in my family, for example, in our family, because the French Quarter during Mardi Gras was a big deal. So what would happen is half my family is in Houston, half my family is Orlando, and people would fly to Pakistan out of Orlando. So what would happen is, or sometimes out of Houston, so what they would do is before they went to Pakistan, they would take a trip from Houston to Orlando or from Orlando to Houston, and on the drive over they would stop over in every February after Mardi Gras. They would stop over in New Orleans at our house, and my father would give them whatever excess money there was that was generated in the busy season of Mardi Gras, and we give it to them, and they would either spend it in the U.S. or take it to Pakistan or whatever. So that was a main way of laundering it. It was that drive back and forth, and always stopping in Louisiana. Okay, tax evasion. So we've been paying employees at the stores via cash, basically the whole time it was open, for 30 plus years, and that's clear tax evasion. All of this is all of this is stuff that I was. That's why I had my notes, but honestly, in conversation with someone, unless he just was listening, I wouldn't have been able to get it out anyway. So I'm glad I'm making this video. But a lot of this stuff I wasn't able to present clearly because it was like understated argument. Like they came in pre-decided a little bit. They didn't want to hear what I was saying. And anyways, so let's keep going. Wrongful use of civil commitment statute. Wrongful use of civil commitment statute. So yeah, they did that to my cousin previously, and then prior to me leaving the U.S., they did that to me too. Failure to provide a Republican form of government. So I'm asserting that within my immigrant community, but Louisiana generally, due to the corruption, lack of civil law, lack of equal protection under the law, a lack of access to a Republican form of government, subjugation to a crypto-fascist state, the United States government, by making the mistakes permitting the immigration of my tribe to the United States, has fundamentally failed to provide a Republican form of government to one of the people of the United States. And failed as a trust. The government is a corporate trust, and so the preamble sets out the preamble of the Constitution sets out the purposes of the trust. And so in all regards, in all purposes of the trust, right, in all purposes of trust set out in the preamble, the U.S. government has failed to provide a Republican form of government, or a government that guaranteed the goods that were set out for it to secure in the preamble. Okay, let's move on. So like I said at the beginning, there were 4 things that were on my agenda list to discuss with the agent, but I didn't really get to these. I did a little bit maybe, so we're going to the third one. So the third thing I wanted them to understand was the consequences of the totality of the circumstances and the crimes on my life and the life of my mother, right? I did get to speak a little bit about my mother. I think that was the first thing we talked about, but I didn't get to go too much into detail on my situation, but it seemed like they already knew. I'm sure they did. They checked on it before. And so just a little bit about my mom. So she was a practicing gynecologist in Karachi, Pakistan, right? Back in the 1980s, she was making, maybe $70,000 or $80,000 a year, and one of her sisters who stayed in Pakistan was making well over $100,000 with a bunch of perks. In the 2000s, right? So it was a very lucrative job. She had her own gynecology practice. She had a clientele, all that sort of stuff. She was seduced to come to the United States under false premises. Those false premises include the opportunity to practice medicine in the U.S. and also community property interests in the lucrative businesses that my father had, right, in the U.S. And also she was under certain vulnerable circumstances that I won't go into right now. But those were basically the 2 promises. Third, she and her siblings were orphaned when she was very young, and she was taking care of them, she was raising them, and so the ability to provide them and her own children with a better life was clearly the promise, right? So if you look at her trajectory, staying where she stayed in if she stayed in Pakistan versus what was done to her after she came to the United States, it's a clear criminal act. It was basically human trafficking. Regardless of whether there was physical violence, it's psychological violence, and this is one thing where I strongly disagreed with the agent, and I feel like he was a little immature, and maybe more senior agents would correct him on this. is that, psychological control is just as strong as, violence, right? Psychological control can be just as perfect as, putting a gun to someone's head, and so, just because it was more psychological, or seduction or coercion, or keeping, like, pimping is keeping, women reactive, so they keep, associating with you or something, like that sort of psychology driving someone into Stockholm syndrome. It's just as I don't know, powerful as a gun. You know what I'm saying? Especially over a long period of time, and so that's where we began the conversation. Now, getting to me, so basically, you can see over a 30-year trajectory, someone basically who was reduced to utmost drudgery, compared to the life they would have, right? So that's just a little bit, and then in regard to me, physically and psychologically, I was also like Stockholm syndrome from a very young age, CPTSD, eventually at the end, after 20 plus years of torture, OCD, slightly autistic, all sorts of low level anxiety in the background, sleep, night terrors, all that sort of stuff, bodily chronic inflation, disfigurement through the infection since I've had since I was 2 years old. The cruel maintenance of the infection rather than helping to get rid of it, all sorts of stuff that I don't need to go into right now. Sociologically, long-term social isolation, solitary confinement, all those, financial micromanagement, and then also, false imprisonment, like putting me in situations where, they have perfect control over the circumstances, like controlling the circumstances, right? Repeatedly putting me in situations where they have perfect power to control the circumstances, by creating dependencies, right? Sending me to Pakistan for, getting me an apartment, and then, even though I'm not looking for an apartment, I'm going to study in an institution. I'd rather stay at the institution, forcing me to get an apartment, creating the entanglement where I have to pay rent, and then I don't have an income there, so I have to depend on them for the rent. Like creating those type of entanglements repeatedly against my interests, so that they maintain a strong level of control over me. That sort of thing, financial micromanagement, and politically, eventually, they destroy, because we were entangled financially. They maliciously destroyed my credit, gave false reports, to various agencies regarding me, that sort of thing. Okay, I'll move on to the fourth and last agenda item that we're going to go over tonight. Was I want to So the fourth agenda was I wanted to present this offer as a special consultant, right? Like, so I'm pretty good at solving problems. I've basically solved every imaginary problem that's been thrown at me regarding various problems that my father's made up in order to maintain control. But I wanted to offer them this epistemological approach where if you get a panel, I wanted to present my allegations, as a special consultant, to a panel of experts, like field leading experts. So, three psychologists who have expertise in, psychopathy, sociopathy, malignant narcissism, sadistic domineering, bipolar disorder, codependence, and, histrionic disorder, right? So three psychologists, and CPTSD, right? Psychologists who have a clear understanding of such, disorders, personality disorders, and then, three sociologists or social psychologists, or let's say one sociologist, one economist, one political scientist, who understand, tyrannical order, cults, Eastern culture, Eastern order, Eastern society, Pakistani society or Muslim Indian society, like who have particular knowledge of the structure, of the relevant, cultures and societies, right? And then you have three data scientists and three forensic scientists. So you have a panel of 12, right? Like field leading experts who have relevant knowledge, is basically what I'm saying. And that I will present my allegations to them, and then they can verify and direct investigation, right? They can first off verify that what I'm saying is not only possible but plausible, based upon their expertise and their consultation with one another. Each one can give an independent analysis, then each, expertise of three can give a joint analysis, and then the 12 can give an interdependent, interdisciplinary analysis of the situation, right? And they can verify by directing the investigation and discovery that what I'm saying is perfectly true, right? I'm not lying. It's perfectly true. Like, it's exactly how I describe it. I have very detailed allegations occurring over 40 years. I have very detailed allegation of like the abstract eternal idea, like the theory of it, right? So the theory of it, the sub theories of it, and then the narrative of it, right? I have very detailed allegations, and you can have these 12 scientists basically engage in an interdisciplinary process to an independent, interdependent, and interdisciplinary process to verify whether what I'm saying is true, to verify it or falsify it, either way, right? To verify it or falsify it. And this would be possible with relatively not a lot of resources, right? So I was seeking a 1 year contract to make that happen, but based upon their response, or not their response, this one particular agent's response, we didn't get to that. So I think I presented about 60% of these notes off the top of my mind. I don't know what 60% exactly, but yeah, about 60% of these notes, and I wasn't able to get, especially to the second, maybe the second one, we weren't able to talk about the laws in detail, and definitely not four. I just didn't feel comfortable presenting this, and I think it was kind of their objective to dissuade me trying to give them a particular offer to solve the problem. And it also seemed pretty clear that they had some pre-knowledge of the situation in some way. That was also pretty clear. So I think I talked enough about the meeting throughout presenting the notes, so I don't really want to go over the meeting more in detail right now. I think I'm going to end the video there. I'm going to send this to them, and I'm posting it right now so you guys can see it. And I'll talk to you soon. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.